Welcome to the Young Indy Chroniclers, a podcast about the making of the show The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which first aired on ABC in 1992.
Kept thinking about what was Indiana Jones like as a young man. I came up with this idea of him seeing the world through the eyes of a soldier and a secret agent.
Over the course of our podcast, we're going to talk to a whole host of very talented people who either worked on this show or were there from the beginning.
We were able to shoot it on location in the real places where these events took place.
Oh, make it up as you go. Oh boy, that's great advice.
We hired some of the best European directors, a whole host of very, very talented people.
I'm your host, Peter Holmstrom.
And I'm Daniel Noah, and this is the Young Indy Chroniclers.
There's only one rule, Indiana. Stay alive.
Welcome back to the Young Indy Chroniclers. This is the one and only podcast devoted specifically to the Young Indiana Jones television series and franchise. I'm your host, Peter Holmstrom, and joining me on this adventure of a lifetime is Mr. Daniel Noah.
Hello, Peter.
The thing that I perpetually love about what George Lucas sought to achieve with Lucasfilm and Skywalker Ranch was to give creatives the opportunity to create. In Hollywood today, most 20-somethings come to town with dreams of being paid to create, only to receive the crushing realization that the higher-ups really just want you to stay in the lowly role that you were hired for, forever and always, and have to convince themselves that they actually wanted a career as a PA all along. But George Lucas and Lucasfilm were not that way. On today's show, we are thrilled to have a man for whom Young Indiana Jones was kind of a playground. He had almost every role on the series you can think of: sound engineer, editor, second unit director, writer, and director of perhaps the strongest entry of the franchise, Attack of the Hawkmen. Truly a living legend. I cannot believe we get to have him on a guest today. Mr. Ben Burtt, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to join you. I've never talked about Young Indiana Jones before in any interview, so you're going to get something. I don't know what you're going to get. It's going to be fresh. Memories dredged up from, 30 years ago? Something like that.
You know, before we even get to Young Indy, though, I'd love to start by asking, because I think like one of the things that we're kind of fighting against on this show is there's kind of this common knowledge or common belief that's completely inaccurate, but a common belief that like Lucasfilm was kind of just like on hiatus between 1983 and like 1994. Which couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, it was an incredibly busy time. But I wonder if you could take us back to like the late 80s, early 90s, prior to Young Indy, but like what was kind of your role like at Lucasfilm at the time? What was kind of the atmosphere at Lucasfilm in that era?
I had been, of course, given the assignment of being the sound designer on the feature films that Lucasfilm was doing. That is Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Willow, and so on in the 80s. But because those films were spaced a few years apart, there was activities at Lucasfilm going on all the time for me. I was sort of a Swiss Army knife. That is, I could be I called in as a picture editor. I could run out with my video camera and shoot some temp videomatics if they were developing something. Even had a hand at doing some writing on the Droids TV series.
Master Munger, it's me, C-3PO.
3PO, it is you. Did they get the ship? Did anyone escape?
I'm afraid I don't know, sir. I think they only abducted droids, including an R2 unit who is a good friend of mine.
I love droids. I will die on that mountain. I think droids is fantastic.
And I thank George for the fact that he let me have those opportunities. I was in a unique position, probably because I had come out of film school at USC, as George had before my time. You know, we weren't there at the same time. But since I had basic training in the areas of production, I was a handy person to go to for small assignments. And so a lot was going on during that period. We were developing tools. We were developing a tool called the Edit Droid. This is back when George was one of the many projects he funded and divisions of the company to create new digital tools. We did not have digital cinema then. We had film cinema. And he had this forethought there could be new ways of doing things. He was always speaking about it and looking for new technology. And if it wasn't there, by golly, he was going to invest and create a division in the company.
Right after Star Wars, I decided there was possibility here of digital technology to be introduced into the process of making movies. So we started the computer division. We put together a group of guys headed by Ed Catmull.
Lucasfilm really was the only place at that time willing to take a risk. And George did take the risk.
So I was working in some of those research projects, especially with the Edit Droid. Now, the Edit Droid was an early non-linear editing system. So we can talk about that because it got its greatest use on Young Indiana Jones, the most successful use of the Edit Droid. And it was a pioneering effort in many ways, which led to the methodology of how the prequels of Star Wars was put together later. And then it opened up a whole world, which is common today, to have nonlinear editing and digital technology where you can manipulate the image freely at your workstation. You can inject your own videomatics, that is temporary shots that you create just to get a sense of where things are going. You can add music and sound very quickly and cut and paste. It's all very efficient. And these techniques really all had their seeds with Young Indiana Jones. Aside from the filmmaking that was taking place on those shows, there was all this, it was a test bed for what George Lucas had in his imagination for the future of feature films.
I was able to give it a very large, epic look using the new digital technology that we were experimenting with to create large crowd scenes. That was the forerunner of what I was ended up using for the new Star Wars film.
At that time, I was doing some editing of outside films. I was working a lot in IMAX films during that period. We had a few IMAX films come to Sprocket Systems, which was the sound department later to become Skywalker Sound. And that was a format which really appealed to me because of it was the only format at the time where you had 6-track magnetic sound in a theater. That really was uncommon in feature film theaters. And I got involved in directing and doing sound design on some IMAX films on space.
Look at how thin the atmosphere is. Everything beyond that thin blue line is a void of space. And everything below it is what it takes to sustain life. And everything that we do to this environment and our quality of life is below that little thin blue line. That's the only difference between what we enjoy here on Earth and the really harsh, uninhabitable blackness of space.
And an IMAX film called Alamo, The Price of Freedom, done by Keith Merrill.
It is imperative that we keep and hold the Alamo. Come and take her, boy!
Niagara and a few others. And so I was bouncing around doing different sorts of things in front and behind camera.
For some of the younger listeners out there, it might be worth pointing out that IMAX back in the day hadn't quite made the common leap to major motion pictures in terms, studios weren't really behind the format. So IMAXs at the time were often documentaries. They would be aired at science museums that did have an IMAX ratio. I think I remember the Niagara one. That was quite fun. But I was at the OmniMax up in Portland, Oregon. It was a dome screen, which never quite took off as a format.
Yeah, there were about 110 theaters worldwide, either the dome version called OmniMax or the flat screen, giant screen called IMAX. And it was a 65 millimeter film, which ran horizontally through the camera. So you had a frame, somewhat almost a postcard in size. And it was a very high fidelity. It was high def long before high def became commonplace. And yes, most of the films were natural history films or science films. I happened to work on a bunch of either historical recreations like Niagara and also space films for the National Air and Space Museum, which were documentaries about the space program focusing on the space shuttle and its missions in the 80s.
That's fantastic. I wonder if you have any recollection of the first time that you had heard about the idea that Indiana Jones was going to come to television. I mean, Last Crusade had finished up, but as I recall, you were nominated for an Academy Award for that one.
Since those early movies, the greatest addition to filmmaking has been sound.
And the Oscar for Best Achievement in Sound Effects Editing goes to Ben Burtt and Richard Hims for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Well, we have a lot of people to thank. We want to thank the members of the Academy. We want to thank our family at Skywalker Sound North, all the people that have given us such support in putting these films together. And especially George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who have inspired us and taken us on so many adventures that we could enjoy together. Thank you very much.
At some point there, you either heard or maybe George told you directly, it's like, we're going to bring Indiana Jones to television. Like, do you have any recollection of that?
I don't remember the specific moment, but I do know this, that when projects started, usually George would bring it up in some casual conversation. Oh, yeah, by the way, I'm thinking of doing a film called Empire Strikes Back, or I'm going to do Raiders of the Lost Ark. I would just hear about it in conversation. I knew that he was passionate about teaching history. He loved the study of history. And he also was very interested in archaeology. Well, those are the reasons, of course, he had done Indiana Jones, the feature films with Harrison Ford.
Archaeology is our religion. Yet we have both fallen from the pure faith.
So I can't recall exactly when it was, but somewhere in 1991 or so, he indicated that there were writers at work developing a series of adventures of young Indiana Jones. And of course, we had seen young Indy in Last Crusade, so we kind of had that idea. I think it certainly grew out of the fact that there was a young Indy in Last Crusade. And everybody said, well, that was kind of fun. You know, has a relationship with his father. We learn all about his background, see where things came from. But there wasn't an aha moment where a curtain was drawn and there we were. As I say, I was busy with other projects around the ranch, Skywalker Ranch. We had moved out there at that time, and just heard in conversation from George that he had writers on it, and he had this dream of doing a series of Indy from the time he was 10 onward up until the adult Indiana Jones, which I suppose comes about in around 1930 or something, you know, the mature Indiana Jones. So he talked of a whole chronicle, breaking down Indy's life into chapters which were a sequence that would connect together, going through his lifetime growing up. And they'd all be based on historical events and people so that you would learn something along the way. You've gone over this in your show previously, but there was an educational element to it, but it really was George's love for that period in history. You know, that period in history was a transition from, you might say, the world of a horse and cart to transcontinental flight. And that could be a span that could be set down on one person's lifetime. You know, born at a time when they delivered ice to your house by wagon, you know, and then lived until a time in which, well, man went to the moon. And so this Indiana Jones character had a chance to witness those kind of historical changes. And so it allowed for the opportunity for someone to weave their way through history and be connected with these different events. So it was justified in that by the time period.
Well, then why did we fight in the war? Why did so many people die? Are you saying that it was all for nothing?
No war is for nothing. But when it's over, it turns out to be something quite different from what was believed at the start. And the result is never intended to be what it is.
You know, Peter kind of hit this in his intro, but you kind of held every job on the show. How would you describe your role on the show? Like, if someone's like, what did you do on Young Indy? You know, what was your role on the show? How would you describe it?
I was sort of second unit director is probably the best description. What happens in any film production is you'll have a cast, you'll have a crew, a principal crew, and you'll have a director. Simon Windsor, let's say, or Carl Schultz making an episode. But because the episodes are done in a constrained amount of time, not an unreasonable amount of time, but there wasn't time to waste, there's often many shots and sequences within an episode, which doesn't really require necessarily the attention of the principal director and maybe not even the principal cast. There's many shots, establishing shots of a church, establishing shots of Paris, a shot of the pen writing on a letter. There was a lot of that in Indiana Jones, over the shoulder of somebody writing a note or a letter. The classic cutaway to the clock, you might say. And so as the shows are being produced, there's this need for a smaller unit of people, camera crew and brips, whatever you need for the sake of the shot you're getting, to be on hand to pick up those assignments. So you may, it's common on every movie. I mean, Peter Jackson might have had 9 units working on Lord of the Rings series, because you've got a mountain unit and a river unit and so on. Young Indy was done under circumstances like the old studio system, say at Warner Brothers, where you'd have a main director shooting with Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland on Robin Hood, but there'd be somebody else doing the horse chase, and the visual effects people doing the matte paintings and shots for that. Young Indy had the same needs. And so I got involved shooting. Actually, my first connection really with Young Indy was that they were putting together a pre-visualization of a sequence in Spring Break, where there's a attack on a fort and a train.
Indy, you gotta use that. Did you ever kill a man, Indy? Indy. Vamos a Ciudad Guerrero. Dígame. There's only one rule, Indiana. Stay alive.
And Young Indy and Remy involved in this. And they had purchased, to help them, some footage from Old Gringo, a Gregory Peck movie. There was a grand scale battle film in a Pancho Villa type era setting, and they were going to be shooting and integrating that footage with the fresh new Young Indy footage to save money. This is a typical thing. But we wanted to let the principal unit know, well, what shots do we really need of Young Indy and Remy, and what are they doing in this battle? And so George said, well, can you make some shots for me? So I had done this before. I just take my home video camera. I'm at the ranch. I go find a couple of costumes of soldiers, put together, grab a few friends, get the camera, and I get some rifles, and we start finding walls or bushes and places we can hide around on the ranch, doing some shots. There were horses at the ranch at that time, so we got a couple of horses out. I dressed up as Young Indy with the fedora and hat, and we started doing run-bys on horses. And then George got involved. He said, well, I want to get this traveling shot. So he got in the back of a pickup truck, driving down the road at the ranch, and I was with a few other people galloping alongside in a meadow. And I got kicked off my horse, made a great shot. I did a great almost running W, one of those old horse stunts. Fortunately, it rained the day before, and the ground was really soft, so I just splashed in a lot of mud. And we did a whole sequence of shots of Young Indy doing this, Young Indy doing that, and then George would take those videos up and then cut them into sequences that they're assembling on that Spring Break show, so they can then complete the battle. They can see the shots. They've got these crude shots that I've done, cut into the sequence. And then they can send that to the director and the second unit director who's doing the show at that time. Here's the shots we want. There's 8 shots. They're exactly like this, from this particular angle, this particular action. And so it's an efficient way of giving a shot list to the production. So I started out by doing these cheap and dirty videomatics, directing them it was like student filmmaking at the ranch. And that evolved to taking the material that I would shoot and actually getting the actual 16 millimeter material after it was shot on location, and then cutting it and integrating it into the scene in the show. because since I shot it, I was familiar with the action and the sequence. It was quicker for me to kind of put it together than to let the main editor do it. And so that was kind of step two. I was doing Videomatics, then I was cutting the shots in since I sort of owned the sequence. And then they said, well, why don't you just go on location with the unit and do the second unit there? Because since I was an editor, I understood camera angles and I knew, enough about directing to handle that sort of thing. So then I was sent off to Africa to actually start doing real shots.
Wow.
And that was amazing.
Wow.
Because I think at that point, I can't remember all the sequences, but I was doing these second unit shots, but then I got handed Verdun to cut. And that was the first episode that I had the responsibility for editing that whole show. And so that was keeping me busy. But then at some point after Verdun, I was sent to Africa to help in the crew on location as second unit director. And I had a very interesting experience because I had seen, Corey Carrier's Indy and Margaret Teasack, Lloyd Owens, and that whole grouping. I'd seen in, episodes of them, an episode or two, their material cut together. So I was sent to Africa. It was a long trip. You get kind of tired and jet lagged. I was put in a truck and was in Nairobi. I was driven out to some location in some farm, sugarcane field somewhere down a road. It might as well be 100 years ago, little farmhouse. And there on the front veranda are Young Indy and his parents in costume waiting for him to arrive. And it was just like I had stepped into the movie, like went through the screen. They were all in character. They were all in costume, and here I was the time traveler. And hello, here's Lloyd Owen, here's Margaret Teasack, here's Ruth Sosa, and there I was on location in a beautiful, real environment. And I was part of the crew then for a few weeks, shooting in Africa, doing parts of different shows, and that was an extraordinary transition. So. Once I got associated with the productions, then I was coming and going from Lucasfilm here in California, editing and doing a little bit of sound design, and then going off for periods of time for the next few years, really, on and off to Prague, to Africa, to Paris, to places where I would then shoot second unit material. I'd inherit part of a show. Sometimes it was as simple as one shot of the Eiffel Tower with a wagon going in front of it or something. And other times I'd get a whole sequence to complete because there just wasn't time for the main director to do it under the schedule.
I mean, that's just honestly the dream. It sounds like I feel like everyone who gets into filmmaking, they're allured by that idea of just like having that kind of adventure where it's like you're going all around the world and you're on these beautiful locations. Well,
especially in today's all digital world, where you'd more likely end up with a green screen surrounding you, or a wall of projected imagery behind your characters. At this time, we could not rely on any technology like that. So you went to real places. You dealt with the sunlight as it was, or if it was a rainy day, you still had to shoot, but then now the scene's in the rain, or it was cloudy and you couldn't wait. This was not a luxurious production where you'd be waiting around for days for just the right light. No, you got up every day and you shot the schedule that Rick McCallum and his team had put together, and you did the best you could under ever-shifting conditions. But it was a very well-managed, produced show. Rick McCallum did a terrific job of taking the money they had and having it end up being material on screen. It was a lean and sort of, you might say, lean and mean kind of operation where everybody, especially on location, would participate in all aspects of it. we'd roll in with the trucks on some location, and there'd be Rick unloading camera cases. Everybody had to participate. Nobody could go just sit around and wait for somebody else to do the job. What needed to be done was handled by all of us. It was the only way to get things done. So there was a great sense of camaraderie and a family nature to it. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. But
no, not at all.
It's kind of that's how I got pulled into the show. As I say, then for the next few years, I was just coming and going, either editing a show back at Skywalker Ranch, or I was off on location. And then we started shooting a lot in the United States, in Wilmington. And then I was running around California trying to match locations of scenes done in Africa or the Czech Republic for insert shots and things. One of the ways that the show worked, the process was that they would shoot, as I say, they would stick to a tight schedule of shooting. It meant sometimes that some sequences didn't get all the shots they might have needed, or maybe a sequence didn't quite get done. But nonetheless, then they would come back and they would edit the show together, and then you could see what the issues were. Where was it weak? What was missing? Did a story point really work? No, it didn't. So we really need to write a little new scene to fix something. And then they allowed time in the schedule and the budget for always going back and collecting improvements to the shows. And that's what I was involved in, a lot of that. So, I mean, I probably contributed a shot or two to every episode, but I can't say for sure. Sometimes I couldn't remember which letter I'm filming, or what is George Hall doing today? I don't know, where is he? Kind of thing. They had lots of interesting adventures,
I figured you probably are one of the few people who did touch every single episode. I think it's a small group of maybe 3 or 4 people, but you're definitely on that list.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Because like the episode Peking, I remember, I think the only thing I did on that was film a bunch of suitcases washing down a river.
My bag. Oh, my bag. Oh, Pete, where's my bag?
And the luggage hadn't gone in the river. All our food, clothes, medicine, all our money. We really have lost everything.
We had to wait till there was a big rainstorm here in Marin County, and then we got a bunch of old luggage, and we found a little raging torrent out in the canyon, and we just started throwing luggage in there and then going downstream and filming it float by and picking it up and running back up and throwing the luggage in again until it was so soaked it wouldn't float any longer.
Well, that was a very important shot.
Yeah.
You
needed to know what happened to the luggage. I mean,
yeah,
it's
exactly. So, and sometimes those things only came up after the show was cut together. You said, "Oh, we just didn't hit a point strong enough. Let's go back and get something else."
I think it's one of the things that both Daniel and I just love about the series is that, like, it was continually kind of a work in progress in a very positive sort of way. I mean, television today, oftentimes shows only get like 5 days to shoot, and then that's it. There's no reshoots. There's no ability to go back and fix. And yet, George, I mean, and the show is like, not only, even after it aired on ABC, there was still this desire of like, well, we can make it better. And that's just really cool.
Well, that's just George Lucas's way of working. He never wanted to have sprawling, long schedules, even on the features. He always felt, and rightfully so most of the time, that films could be done much more efficiently than what you would normally see in a Hollywood feature. He had been kind of soured early on in his career before he had his success with, American Graffiti, witnessing how Hollywood made films and kind of realized these are the kind of enjoyment he got out of the process. He could see it being done more efficiently other ways. He loved film school. Film school at USC was a situation where you always were an underdog. You had a very limited budget. You were only given so many rolls of film to make your movie. The faculty said, well, you got to do this with 8 rolls of film or whatever the shooting ratio is going to be. And so you got to plan accordingly and shoot quickly and make decisions and have a good plan. And George liked that kind of underdog feeling. I think it was stimulating creatively. It was more fun to have limitations and then try to figure out limitations will sharpen your creative focus. You might have had something really elaborate in mind, but in actuality, what you only needed was something very simple. I'll give an example on Young Indy. I'll get back to that other point, but on Attack of the Hawkmen, there was a scene where Young Indy is supposed to get a briefing from a spy, a general in the French intelligence about what the mission's going to be to go meet Anthony Fokker. And so I was the director of the show. We had this elaborate, we were in an old museum that was closed in Prague, and I'm going to have them come in the door and they sit down over here. And while they're talking, they walk to the map and they go over. I had this David Lean sensation or something going on in my naive head, all planned for the day.
Captain Henry Defonce? Yes, sir. Captain, please sit down.
But what happened was we had a power failure and we couldn't get any lights into this room. And so all we could get power to was from a desk lamp, one desk lamp. So we put a desk lamp on a small table in the middle of the room, just had the desk lamp light the map, and had Indy and the general sit on opposite sides of the table, and they just point to it and talk. And that was the whole scene. But the fact was, that's all it was needed. It was just about getting this exposition forward. And of course, having this one light made it more suspenseful.
Yeah.
Because the light was just sort of half lighting their faces. And so that limitation turned out to be something good for me. I would have wasted a lot of time, because I did waste time as a newbie director, thinking that I would do all these elaborate camera moves and clever things. And there was never time to do it. And so you learn what is best for the story here, where should the camera be and what should they say?
Because we don't really mind if the Germans find it. They know we are trying to bribe Fokker. Of course, if they do find it, they will shoot you.
But anyways, I was going back to George Lucas's kind of attitude about efficiency and film school. He liked film school because not only were you an underdog making the films, it was you versus the faculty, they're like the front office of the studio. But also, then there's the camaraderie of the students all worked. There was an editing room where everybody would be cutting their separate films. They're sitting, back to back, shoulder to shoulder in the editing rooms. And then you'd have there's a little patio outside where you could constantly talk ideas and look over people's shoulders and share what you're doing. That was a very pleasant creative situation for him. And so he wanted to recreate that by building the ranch. You have a place where 5 or 6 filmmakers could be working together. There's none of the kind of barriers that you might have in Hollywood over the breakdown of labor, and you're free to share your ideas with a family around you. And so he reproduced that kind of atmosphere, especially with Young Indy. Small crew, everybody was kind of aware of what's going on. I mean, look, filmmaking stressful. There's not happy days all the time. There's cases where you're exhausted or things don't work out and you're trying to solve problems.
Do you want to go back at all? Back? There is no back. There's only forward.
I don't want to say, it was a wonderful series. They're lovely. Everybody was great. Yes. No, it was a lot of struggle. It was like a sports season where you're up against one problem after another. To have to try to win or lose, or sometimes walk away with a failure of some kind of shot or something. But generally speaking, it was a family atmosphere and very stimulating. I will say that I think those 4 years in there, 4 or 5 years, was the happiest period for Lucasfilm overall.
Wow.
For me, looking back, that was the happiest. Just the way the work flowed was fun. You didn't have that situation where on feature films, especially today, you work for several years You labor over a film, and then you've got one weekend for it to prove itself. And then it's up, down, voted good or bad. And that's a lot of stress. And it's not much of a reward to be submit in the end to that sort of judgment. Whereas with the TV series, of course, they wanted to have better ratings and create a bigger stir than maybe they did. But in the course of making each show, it was only so many weeks, and then you're off to the next show. Fresh slate, starting over with a new topic, a new guest star, a new location. It was very stimulating. And if you'd learn from each show about how you could do it better. I think everybody learned that way.
You know, it feels like for us on the outside that in many ways Rick McCallum was kind of like the perfect producing partner for George. You know, he had the right mindset of like, let's figure out how to do this for a very tight budget, but also let's let creatives be creative. His job was to be a producer first. I wonder if you had any thoughts about working with Rick and your experiences with him on the set.
Well, Rick, of course, he's the boss. Rick was an amazingly energetic guy. He was always giving a pep talk to everyone. Unlike many producers, he would show up every day and he would go around and meet everybody on the crew, say good morning, ask a question about what's going on with them. And that's good leadership, because you want your crew members to feel vital. And Rick was genuine in that aspect. He would be a cheerleader for everybody. There were times, of course, where he had to say, no, you can't do this, or we can't do that. But those were very rare. He had a very can-do attitude. And it surprised me, because what he delivered on the, sort of modest budgets we had were amazing. We had incredible access operating out of London with, costumes, and we had a lot of talent in, of course, we were bringing up David Tattersall, and others were, learning their trade. I mean, contributing as they're on their way up. I was involved a lot with the stunt people for quite a while, and we had a little group of, say, 6 or so stunt men.
Sean takes the time to listen to what's going on, and he sticks around and he knows what everybody's doing.
You work during the day, you spend an hour or two setting up something that's going to last for 3 seconds. You have to focus a lot of creative energy into choreography, really, a little bit at a time. The whole sequence will be made up of little pieces of action, which when cut together, hopefully will flow as one energetic adventure.
It was just like the old days in Republic serials. These guys would pretty much do anything and occasionally get hurt or burned, but they just kept going. And Rick he's not a perfect human being. I guess I could say that. I mean, there are times when the pressure on everybody gets to the point where he has to maybe, give the riot act to a few people once in a while, because there were problems of getting things done and on a cost, on an efficient basis. But I always felt with Rick that, how to put this, that you just had to keep an eye on him, in kind of a way, make sure that sometimes if they're going to do something, you want to try to verify it, make sure that this is the way we're going to do something. But looking back, he was not the guy sitting in his office on a phone all the time, out of touch. He was on the set. He was in a tent nearby. He was staying in the tent with everybody else, just like everybody else. Maybe he's first one up in the morning, and helping getting the meals ready and stuff like that. He was very good for that series.
I started working with Lucasfilm in 1990, and we started at that time with the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which George kind of envisioned as one of the longest and most complicated location shoots ever to be done. And it turned out that way. We shot for over 4 years, and we shot in 25 countries. I feel like I'm the kind of general that has to get all the troops together to be able to resolve the issue that the President of the United States wants done.
And it was a proving ground because a lot of the people, including Rick, went on to do the prequels. You know, a lot of the British camera crew folks and others.
You mentioned going to Africa, and I was curious. There's a big battle in the episode with Albert Schweitzer that opens that two-parter.
Yes.
Sergeant, karibu sa kanyang pagkakitiho.
Indio, is that? Try to run faster.
I was curious if you directed it as a second unit director at the time. I guess I'll just ask that. Did you direct that scene?
Yes. Well, it was a combination. Simon Windsor, yeah, it must have been Simon Windsor was directing that episode.
He did direct the episode.
Yeah. The way we worked on that battle scene, of course, we had a large battlefield already constructed, and it had, emplacements for, one army, and Indy's group was attacking. And the way we did it was that Simon Windsor would set up a main shot with his principal actors, Indy and Remy and so on, and have some cameras in place. Now, once he got everything in place for a take, whether it was a wide shot of everybody charging or something like that, then second unit, which would be me, we'd figure out a way we could sneak a couple more cameras into that action to cover close-ups or individual stunts. We might talk to one particular stunt man and say, okay, while you're charging, we got a camera right here, and you're going to run over and fall over that camera or in front of it and kick up a lot of dust or something. So we were working simultaneously so that he could orchestrate the main movements in the battle for a given shot. And then second unit, we would figure out ways of attaching cameras to it. We had a bunch of cameras, several extra cameras, and we also used these little 16 millimeter gun cameras called G-Zap cameras. They take about a 100-foot roll of 16 millimeter film, and you can. There used to be gun cameras in airplanes during like World War II, and they're kind of indestructible. You have a wide angle lens on them, and you can put them right on the ground. You can dig a little hole, a little trench, and hide it right where there's going to be an explosion in the foreground, and then you can have a stuntman come up and he'll capture the explosion and the guy coming through the smoke or the fire. And so we would plant those cameras around, and they were expendable cameras as well. If it came to that, the fun thing was we'd start all these cameras, they'd call for action, people run through usually things only last a few seconds. They charge in a wide shot, a bunch of explosions and things, and then we run in and turn off the G-Zap cameras, the little gun cameras, and we get ready for the next shot. Sometimes the camera would be all blackened because it got blasted by an explosion. What would happen then is after that, Simon Windsor had got his main shots out of the way, and they might the next day move on to a different location nearby. Then second unit would come back, and now we would work with stuntmen, and we would focus specifically on some stunts. We might shoot the parts of the Germans and the gun emplacements where they're loading the machine gun and continually shooting. We would have the Askaris, the native, conscript armies. We would do close-ups of them stabbing each other and throwing spears and all sorts of things like that. Shots of the feet going by and spears would stick in the ground behind them. And so we would focus on. Usually, I would go over storyboards with Simon Windsor or whoever was the principal director, and they would give suggestions of shots they want to have, or I could contribute ideas too. And so we would come back and mop up at that same location on another day or the afternoon of or something like that. And that's kind of the way it worked, is that the main director would be setting up just like Phantom Train of Doom. They would set up a train being blown up, and then second unit would get all our cameras set in other places, and then we would come back and we'd restage a lot of the stunts. Stunts take more time to set up. It might take longer because of the mechanics of the stunt to prep for a shot. So you don't get as many setups per hour, you might say, as you would on live action. I mean, the action with dialogue and so on. So often the stunts, in fact, it was typical in the series that the stunt work, if it was falls or car crashes, something like that, car chases, train chases, whatever it might be, that would fall to second unit. We would work on that because each shot would take a bit more time to set up because of safety and other concerns. That's kind of how it worked. When second unit was working alongside the principal unit. I remember one incident on that battle you mentioned, and I think it was Oganga was the episode. We had a bunch of Maasai warriors as extras, and although they were made up in some other, fanciful kind of costumes, they all had spears. And I had to do a shot where they were going to run up to camera and throw spears, over my head, as if they were firing them people off stage. And so I wanted to just make sure that they knew how to chuck a spear. And so before the shot, and I was sort of picking people out for this warriors, and I set up a target. I just took a piece of plywood and I set it out, I don't know, 10 or 15 yards away from camera. And I said, okay, can anybody hit that? I just put a circle on the board, maybe a foot across. And everybody came up and nailed it.
Wow.
This trunk was like, okay, you guys know how to throw these spears. Okay. I just didn't want somebody to throw something and it go, down into the camera crew or off into someone's eyeball somewhere. And so I got a good laugh out of that because they knew how to throw spears.
Amazing.
The Africans in particular, Simon Crane, when we came back to do Phantom Train of Doom, Simon Crane was the stunt coordinator, and he had kind of a basic training school, which started in Nairobi. They put the word out, we need 100 soldiers, something like that. And so they all met at a soccer field, not volleyball, soccer, in Nairobi, and they had trials where they would have all these young men who showed up, run from one side to the other, and then they would have them run and then jump to the ground and crawl along the ground like soldiers, and see who were the best athletes, and kind of weed out those that didn't look good carrying a rifle, this sort of thing, and sort of had a little school. And out of that, they weeded out a group of young men that were, very athletic and very strong. And you kind of had to hold them back on occasion. I had times when I was doing battle scenes with them, and we had a couple of people get knocked out, things like that, because they would go in with their bayonets and rifles, and they'd really sort of go at it. You had to listen for that realistic thud in the middle of the shot, see if somebody got hit. And they were great to work with. There was a guy named, a stuntman named Desi, and he always was eager to do something. And on Phantom Train of Doom, he said, look, I can throw myself off the train. I'll get shot and I'll fall off the moving train.
Come on, Zoli, I can't hold him off forever! It will go off, couple of minutes! Let's uncouple this thing and get the hell out of Dodge!
And somehow I said, okay, let's try it. And we softened up an area of ground along the railroad tracks. They would turn over the ground so that it wasn't completely packed earth. And the train is moving, and Desi's got a rifle, and he's shooting, and he times himself. And as we go past this spot, he throws himself off the train, kind of spinning in the air as he goes. No pads on the ground, nothing, no crash pad. You see him just hit the ground, full force, and I thought he was probably be killed. But he got up, and he was okay. Because the next day he was limping quite a bit. But he said that was okay. He recovered from that. But they were daring. And you get into a situation as a second unit director, especially doing stunts, where you want to have the thrill of things looking physically real. And that involves some risk. And of course, risk is something you got to carefully manage on a movie set. You take it to the edge sometimes, especially when we were in Africa. We did not really have a safety officer, let's say, someone to stop us. You had to rely on the judgment of, Simon Crane and some of the professional stuntmen we had with us to see whether, how risky it would be. Because we did a lot of stunts, which everything was potentially, fire or something you could get impaled on, something like that, or fall off a waterfall onto rocks or something like that. So there were a few nervous times, I have to say, and I'm glad we didn't have any. We did have a few little accidents, but I think everybody's healed up by now.
No fatalities. No fatalities.
30 years later, everyone's fine.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
It was a little bit more like making movies in the 1930s, Westerns. A little rough and tough kind of thing. Maybe some of it might have bordered up along foolishness, seeing it now. But, the series delivered a lot of terrific stunt work.
It really did.
And action.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really digitally supported because that just wasn't an option at the time. You tried to be safe. I should say that we did do a little bit of digital. We started, one of the seeds of Young Indy production was we started experimenting with what would be commonplace later in terms of using digital effects to make some stunts doable and safer. I had a scene where it was in the Mystery of the Blues episode, I think, in Wilmington, where there's supposed to be Young Indy jumping off a water tower onto the top of a vehicle driving by, a Model T Ford.
Yeah, yeah.
And, of course, Sean wanted to do it because he would always want to do his own stunts. And we just figured out a way to do it as a split screen where it had a locked-off camera, and Sean jumped from the tower onto crash pads. But he had his legs, stretched out in front of him like he was, as he's falling. He's standing up, and he pretended to land on the car when he hit the crash pads. Then we took the crash pads away and had him on top of the car already, and the car drives by, and he jumps like 6 inches in the air and falls onto the top of the car. And then we merged the two shots together with a soft edge split screen.
Interesting.
I think it worked okay.
Yeah.
We started doing things like that, realizing that we weren't going to be doing stunts. I mean, optical effects in those days were expensive to do. In other words, you shot on film. If you wanted to do any manipulation of the image, that film would have to be sent to an optical effects company where a dupe negative is made and, this sort of thing. And then they would run it through the optical printer with various mats and so on to make something as simple as a dissolve or a split screen. And then you'd get it back, and it could look good. It would always be a dupe of the original footage, so it was a little softer, a little fuzzier, and grain increased a little bit. Those things were detectable, but it also cost a lot of money. You couldn't just do it and do it over again and over again and over again. The budget wouldn't sustain it. But having the ability, just the very dawn of digital at that time, we were able to take some images and play with them in a device called the Flame, which was a video device, which images could be put on video into this device, and you could then see what the results of the effect is going to be and make a decision right then and there how to make it work. You didn't have to, cycle through the lab many times and pay for duplication and so on. So,
wow,
the idea of as the series went along, we got more and more interested in doing visual effects. Yeah, because we got more confident about it. I mean, I'm going to get into some technical stuff. Do you want to go through it?
Please do. Yes, please.
The series was shot in 16 millimeter Kodak film. Here was the process, actually. The show was shot in 16 millimeter and also 35. We would shoot in 35 a shot that we knew we were going to manipulate in some way, because 35 gave us a larger negative. We could crop it, we could pan within it, we could do things in the 35 image, and the quality would hold up. Whereas the 16, you couldn't really blow it up. You want to enlarge a shot, you start blowing the 16 up, it just gets very grainy. So the series was shot, we had two kinds of cameras with us, 16 and 35. But then that film, negative, that came out of the camera, was then taken off and transferred to video. And because from that point on, the show was edited and delivered on video and mastered on video. So that's what exists today, which is a couple steps of video. And since the show is in video, we could edit it on the Edit Droid, which is a video editing system, and they could make what's called an online of that video and make a broadcast master for the show. It was on Beta SP. It was a video format at the time, and that was perfectly good for broadcast television in 1992 and 3, because televisions were maybe 25 inches across at the maximum at home. Small image. And so the 16 image showed up eventually. I mean, the video image, which is much less resolution than film, looked okay in the end. So you ask yourself that question, what happened to the original 16 negative and 35s? They went back into the vault where they are today, and they were never cut. They're still in camera rolls.
Wow.
So because the step that was never done, partly to save money, but it was also technically not necessary because the show was being completed in video, they never cut negative on the shows. So all the negative for Young Indies still exists, and it's just in boxes and cans in a warehouse.
Theoretically very high quality because it's barely been touched ever.
Right. It's hardly, exactly. It's not been touched. It's a gold mine waiting to be,
I mean, this is one of our big questions in this podcast, and I think we've just gotten the answer. But it's like, but from what it sounded like, though, the visual effects were done later, so it was never done on the. Or am I'm mixing this up? So it's like.
Okay.
The question being is like, what would it actually take to get a proper Blu-ray? And it sounds like it would be a massive undertaking, a la the Next Generation remasters, where you literally have to go back to the original negatives.
How long an answer?
We have all day. Please answer.
Let me finish the story. Okay, so it was shot on film, 16 and 35, and then that film was transferred into video, and the film was never touched. It's still in a warehouse today. I've seen it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
All right. And so everything downstream from filming was video and video manipulated, either just as analog video or sometimes offloaded on some very early digital tools, which could take the video image, electronic image, and you could do things to it, change its shape or use Photoshop type techniques, really is what it was, and do special effects. And so that's why the shows today look like they look. They're just standard def. And it would have been tremendously wonderful if they had the foresight thinking that someday high definition would appear, but there was no hint of that at the time. And they should have cut negative on the shows. But that would have been very expensive to do a film finish. This was maybe what was given up by not doing a film finish was what you gained in the production of the show.
Right.
You made these high quality little sort of feature film style movies, and then you didn't finish them like feature film would be. And it's kind of a shame, but that's just a decision that was made. As an experiment, though, I took when Hawkman had its 25th anniversary. What? That's about 10 years ago, because that's an episode that I, personally, think represents the greatest film ever made. It's not the greatest film ever made. I decided to have a anniversary screening of it. So I said I got permission, if I paid for it myself, to transfer a couple rolls of negative from the original film.
Wow.
All right.
Okay, so I only had enough money to do about 10 minutes. I couldn't justify it to my wife or anybody else.
It's very expensive.
Yeah. And so I did an HD scan from the negative of some. I could only take them in the original camera rolls, so I had to take what was on that camera roll. I just couldn't pick a shot here or pick a shot. I had to narrow it down to just a couple things. So I did, and I went down and had transferred it. It looked terrific.
Bet.
But the thing I didn't know, which totally surprised me, was it was shot Super 16, which meant it was actually 177.
Wow.
Oh my God.
So it actually was today's format in width. Okay?
Amazing.
Because I didn't know this, but they had put a mask in the original cameras, so you only saw 4:3. But it was actually recording those sides onto the film.
Oh, wow.
I didn't know that. Now, this is what I discovered on Hawkman. I don't know whether it was that way on every episode. But when I got back the shots from Hawkman, I said, wait a second. It's widescreen cinema. And,
oh, my God.
And fortunately, the shots that I had were some interiors of Indy and Remy being interviewed by one of their generals, and some shots of them getting in and out of their airplanes.
Pt.1, you're going home.
I am?
Are you familiar with the Café Noir in Brussels?
Yes.
You are its new proprietor. All our spies will report to you. You will be our main contact with the White Lady, which is the code name for the Belgian underground.
We were on location with real things, so it was just except for the foot of one assistant director and a C-stand in the corner of a shot, which easily could be painted out, it was widescreen, which is just what you want. It would look like today's, streaming television shows. And so that was very intriguing.
Wow.
And but the problem in, say, doing a whole show that way, well, what you'd have to justify the cost of going back and scanning all the negative, and then matching that negative to the cut of the show. Whoa. And then doing all the visual effects over again, okay? Because they were done in standard def in video. So if they did a matte painting of, the airfield in Hawkman, it's just some extra planes painted in, things of that nature, then you'd have to do that again. So it's almost prohibitive. In theory, you could do it. And I've tried to do what I did with Hawkman, and now this shows craziness, is that, okay, when we had the 25th anniversary, I said, well, I'm going to restore it to its original full cut, okay? Because Hawkman had a 146-page script when we started.
Wow. Oh, wow. Okay.
It was a combination of two episodes. There was an episode written, I guess Rosemary wrote it. I think it was called Ravenel, which was Indy with the Lafayette Escadrille. And then the next episode in the sequence was called Alhorn, and that was Matthew Jacobs, or it's the other way around. I can't remember.
I think it's the other way, actually.
It's the other way around. Matthew Jacobs did Ravenel. Right. And so those were two unproduced scripts. But when it came around to the season where we started doing them as TV movies, the decision was made, well, we want to have these two episodes filmed. They've got scripts for them, but it's got to be a feature film. I mean, a feature like the 90-minute. Well, at that point, they hadn't made the deal with the Family Channel, so they said we just got to make it into a feature film. Okay, it didn't say what length feature film. I think feature film, 2 hours. Okay, because they hadn't made a deal how they were going to be shown yet. They weren't going to be on ABC. They were going to be on some other. The Family Channel specs hadn't been delivered yet. I'm not sure we were thinking of the Family Channel. And so I was given the job as director. I said, well, okay, you've got Al Horn, you've got Ravenel script and Al Horn. I'll try to put them together and make it one movie. I'll keep as much of the story what the original writers intended, but we're going to have to take parts of, and some characters from the second half of the show and introduce them up front if we can in the first half, and vice versa. Bring some of the situations from the front half of the show, so we can blur the edges of this double trajectory, which all the feature films have. And I was sort of given free rein to write up new scenes, whatever I wanted. And so I did, and it came out like around 140-something pages, and it met with approval of George and Rick and everybody. And so we still wasn't sure whether there was even talk at one point, well, it's going to be 2 one-hour shows, like a two-parter, and so the marching orders were just film the whole thing. Okay, so, but in the same time period, we shoot any show, about 30 days. I think it was 35 days, something. Wow. And so that's what I did. I had this, taken what the writers had done in the original concept and tried to make it, add some characters and new scenes here and there to make it work as an overall, two-part movie. That was kind of like when we started out thinking that's what it was going to be.
Walker, you have outdone yourself. This time you have created an unrivaled gun platform with wings.
This plane can twist and turn like a hornet. Climb faster than anything you've had before.
Now, as you know, what happened was that somewhere along the line, the Family Channel deal was made. Although they were still talking about maybe it being 2 one-hour shows. 2 shows that could be shown each in a 90-minute time slot, But then it turned out it was going to be just one broadcast movie. And so we had this really long film on hand. It was like 140 minutes long.
Wow.
Way too long. And it had to be cut down, to fit the 90-minute slot. And so that's what ended up being put on broadcast television, and it was fine. As a newcomer director, I was also the editor, which maybe not always the best idea, especially if you're a new director. You love all the things you did. So I love this dolly shot. It's got to be in the show. Well, wait a minute, we don't need it anymore. That's part of the story. There's that kind of conflict, and I remember when the orders sort of came down, well, we've got to cut it down to a 90-minute broadcast length. I was sort of crushed, but I knew it had to be done. I know as an editor, you quite often, in fact, most often, when you tighten something way up, it gets better. You find out you didn't need all this extra sided margins in the story. Although I had a hard time doing it, it finally, the week I was supposed to cut it down, I actually got the flu and couldn't come in. So they had Dana Mulligan, my assistant, who was also cutting scenes on the series, go through and do the cut with Rick. And that was okay. It was actually probably the best way to do it. Okay. Because Dana was great. We were very close, and she was a good editor. And like every other studio film, the bosses needed to just get in there with the scissors, take this out. And so it had to be done. Okay, so the long story is that when it came around to that 25th anniversary, I said, I'm going to put it all back together again, see what it is. So I did. I still had remnants of all the extra scenes that were in it. And they were hard to find, because it was all old video. And I took the broadcast master of Hawkmen as it was finally finished, and I got it together along with all the outtakes and deleted scenes. I had fortunately saved some tapes of them, and I recut it and put it all back together again. And I couldn't actually, with everything in it, it was too much. I mean, they were right. There were some things in there. There was a whole sequence where Indy and Nungus crash, and there's a whole episode in Belgium with their plane being repaired by nuns and getting chased by spies into a church, and this Irish girl helps them, and there's a whole episode that's not part of it.
Wow. And you shot this?
Yeah, it was all shot and cut.
It's amazing.
It scored and everything. It was there were numerous things. There were other little extended parts of the story there.
Wow. Well, I think we're just both shocked to hear this. I mean, even doing this podcast, we had no idea that there was any sort of serious deleted footage from the series like this.
Yeah, amazing.
Look, why don't we take a little break?
Yeah.
And then we'll come back and we'll hear more about your extended cut of Attack of the Hawkmen next time.
Okay.
Listeners out there, if you want to get in touch with us, you can find us at Young Indy Pod on Instagram. So for Daniel and myself, thanks very much for being here. Until next time, keep on adventuring.
Next time on the Young Indy Chroniclers.
Ben Burtt is back on it.
We knew that Hawkmen would have a bigger challenge. Anytime you say you're going to take your movie aloft, we've seen in many digital reproductions of dogfights, it's very hard to make them look like they're really airborne. Catherine Zeta-Jones gets killed. The idea came up that we needed to have Indy and Daniel Craig have what I call the slugfest. ILM was there shooting for the Star Wars Special Edition. I was there shooting the same stormtroopers because I was doing a documentary about special effects.
There is an internet rumor that the actual song is in fact Linda Ronstadt. Is there any truth to that?